Welcome back and good evening to you. I'm glad that you've joined us again as we continue our study in 2 Timothy. As you know, we're also battling COVID again, and our hope is that we won't all be online, that we would be able to continue the activities on campus. But we're, by the time we get to this portion, which has been recorded a few weeks before tonight. Who knows what even tonight looks like. But as long as we can be on campus, I'll be tied up, but I'm thrilled that you continue to join us and that we will soon finish our study of the pastoral epistles. Last week, we started with a transition toward the thought of end times. I mentioned to you that it would only be natural that Paul in his last letter at some point would talk about not only his own imminent death, but that there would be a death of history as we know it. There is an end times, the last days, which Paul thought he was living. So did all of the other New Testament characters and writers. So that theme began last week. Tonight we continue. One of the things I think is accomplished, I believe is accomplished, is the fact that the young pastor would be able to keep perspective, realizing that there is an end in sight, whether it's in his lifetime or not. God himself only knows. Jesus even said that it's not for us to know the times nor the dates. The days, and so there is an end, and it seems that in these verses that we began last week, and we'll go through and finish up this week, that Paul is saying to Timothy, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The bad news first. The bad news is things are going to get worse, and Timothy may have thought, how could they possibly be any worse? Timothy probably thought his own life was in jeopardy every time he stood up and proclaimed the gospel. He was the leader in a fairly influential church, very influential as a matter of fact. That would have made him a prime target of the Roman Empire. So Timothy must have at times thought, Paul, my mentor in the ministry, my father in the ministry, is in a prison waiting certain martyrdom. And I'm a prime target for that. Other men of faith have lost their lives because of their preaching. How could it get any worse? But Paul says it's going to get worse. So in the last days, it will get worse. That's the bad news. The good news is the last days. Paul's essentially saying it will one day end on this earth. This will end. The trouble will end, and when it does, we will have what we have longed for. So tonight, beginning in verse 6, he says, "From among them are those who worm their way into the households and capture idle women." This is still part of the bad news. This is the worst days. They will worm their way into the households and capture idle women burdened down with sins, led along by a variety of passions, always learning and never able to come to a knowledge of truth. Then he names two that are examples, that Jannes and Jambres, resisted Moses, so these also resist the truth. And we'll look at that in just a moment. I want you to notice that these seducing marauders that worm their way, weave their way, slick their way into the church, prey on the most vulnerable. In this case, they're preying on women. They get in by trickery, and then they sneak around within the body in the disguise of spiritual leaders, so that they have access to and manipulate and eventually capture or draw away these women. And then the women are described, and when I say vulnerable, what I mean is the description that he gives for these women. These women are vulnerable not because they're women, but because they are these things. They are idle. First of all, they're idle. And let me just pause for a minute. Men who have these same characteristics are also very vulnerable to the enemy. Satan does his best work with men or women in this described in these ways. First of all, they're idle. That means that they don't have a sense of purpose. They don't have a sense of direction. They don't have goals in life. The word itself implies they are immature. They're living in the moment and for the moment. And if you're only living for the moment, you're going to make poor decisions that will maybe bring you very short-term pleasure, but will cost you long-term sacrifice. We are vulnerable to the enemy when we are bored, when we are free of responsibilities. I believe part of the reason so many things we are seeing now, we find it hard to believe what humanity is capable of. I believe it's because humanity is much more free, much more bored, much more idle than we have been historically. These are those that are susceptible to the enemy. They're idle. Number two, they are burdened down. They're tired. They're weary. They've grown weary carrying the heavy load of guilt. They find the prospect of someone holding them up and coming underneath them, holding them up, building them up, edifying them. They find that quite enticing, and so they become easy prey for that one who's willing to use the verbiage of one that is on your side or in your corner. They take advantage of those that are weakened by the heavy load, the burden of guilt. The third characteristic of these vulnerable ones is that they are led by passion. They're led by emotions. One's emotions, one's passions, they are the most surface of all the personality traits. The highs they experience cause a certain euphoria and pulls them in and gives to them the awe of that moment. But then the lows that cause them to be dependent on someone else's strength is just as prevalent. So it's the highs that cost you. It's the lows that cost you. The highs and the lows are your passions, your emotions. That's why we have to be so very careful. I've heard so many down through the years remind us your emotions will lie to you. They will call something good that is not good for you. They will call something bad that is not bad for you. But if you are making decisions out of your emotions, you become prey to those who are seducers, those that are they are liars, and they are working for the enemy. So those that are idle, those that are burdened down with guilt, those that are led by their emotions, and finally, those that are always learning but not gaining knowledge of the truth. And this is it's intriguing that this characteristic is coupled with the other three. The other three make perfect sense to us. They are related. You can almost see the way each one perhaps leads to the next. But this last one, they're always learning but never gaining knowledge, is a little more difficult to understand. I think what it means is that they are drawn to teaching, but they never really apply what they've learned. That they are learning, but they're not applying that, and it doesn't mark you until you apply it. These qualities are quite immature. For instance, I had a lady once ask me if I'd ever heard of the Bible study Experiencing God. I actually referenced it a few weeks ago in our church service. She said, have you ever heard of Henry Blackaby's Experiencing God? I said, yes, ma'am. I've heard of it. I've done it as a personal devotion, and I've led it in our church in the past. And she said, "Oh, we've had it in our church 3 times, and I love it. Can we have it again? Will you lead it again?" And I thought the whole purpose of it is not just to keep learning these principles. It's applying the principles to where you won't have to do Experiencing God Bible study again. You're living out the principles, and that's what these vulnerable, that he says, these idle women that are burdened down, these women that he describes how they are burdened down. The qualities of their immaturity make them very, very susceptible to the enemy's attacks. Then verse 8, that's where he begins to call some more names. He said, just as Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, these also resist the truth. Now, let's stop for a moment. That word resist doesn't mean resist in terms of not believing. What it means is resist in terms of pushback. That Jannes and Jambres were those that pushed back. Now, we don't know exactly who they were because they're not mentioned anywhere else in Scripture. But the Jewish oral traditions, of which Paul would have been very, very familiar, the Jewish oral traditions suggest that these are the two leading magicians during the moments where Moses was challenging Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go. And they weren't mentioned anywhere else in Scripture, but there's reason to believe that they were at least associated based on what we have here. They did resist Moses, and there were magicians in Egypt that performed certain illusions, and by so doing pushed back against Moses and against what God was saying through Moses. The plagues that the initial first plagues were, they were illusions that Jannes and Jambres was able to perform. These two sorcerers, I believe, symbolize the determination of false teachers in the end times. In the end times these false teachers simply want to build a gathering, build a number of influenced. They want to be the influencer for the influenced. And by doing that, they will lead that group to resist the teachings of God. And Paul's warning Timothy that that's going to happen. There will be in the last days those who resist the teachings of God. And the souls of their followers become hardened to the gospel. And we know the Antichrist will perform miracles and illusions empowered by Satan. And you may or may not think much about this or know this, but every cult, every false religion, every cult ever established typically begins with a seducer and begins in the family of God. The seducer targets the family of God. Pulpits and classrooms are populated with liberal teaching who argue against the orthodoxy of Scripture. That last phrase reminds us that even in the last days, when it seems like these two false prophets have made great strides in leading the church or holding the church at bay or leading the church away, that they themselves will be stopped. That's how it says. But they will not make further progress. They will be stopped. And that's, again, good news and bad news. The bad news is that these last verses describe the last days and we're living in them. But the good news is that they're not going to last forever and that Jesus ultimately has victory and that the church will reign. And that's the promise that God has given us in His Word. And that's the promise you and I are standing on. Well, I hope you have a blessed rest of this week. I hope you're praying for our church on Sunday, and I trust God's going to continue to move in a magnificent way.